Yeah, man. So I've been trying to come up with some ideas about, we always in hip hop, we talking about goats, right? Goat status. I know you were telling me you had a couple ideas for a criteria for what really defines a GOAT, because I was listening to Snoop. Snoop was rapping about how, he wasn't really thinking that, Eminem had just dropped some new stuff and how he wasn't really in his top 10.
Eminem, the great white hope. White rappers had zero respect in rap. Let's keep that 1,000. None. He has probably put Eminem in a position where he could be labeled as one of the top 10 rappers ever. I don't think so. But the game feels like he's top 10 lyricists and all that comes with it. But that's just because he's with Dr. Dre, and Dr. Dre helped him find the best Eminem that he could find.
See, I feel like people like you, Snoop, keep people honest. Because I respect Eminem. And I can see why people would have him in his top 10, top 5. I personally don't. You've been around a long time. Why don't you have him in your top 10?
Because there's some niggas in the 80s that he can't fuck with.
Like who?
Like Rakim.
Yes, sir.
Like Big Daddy Kane.
Yes, sir.
Like KRS-One. Like LL Cool J. Shall I go on?
I love this list. Yeah, again.
Like Ice Cube. You understand me? I ain't got no time to play with it. It is what it is. It's like, Cuz did that. He did that to the fullest. That's one of my teammates. That's one of my brothers. He did that. But when you talking about this hip hop shit that I can't live without, I can live without that.
So how you feel about GOAT status criteria, how we get to that? Because that's a major discussion in hip hop, is always who's your top 5 or top 10 and how do you get to the GOAT?
Yeah, so that GOAT discussion is always marred in, recency bias and cultural affinities that would just, frustrate the discussion and cause, beefs and things like that. So this being a scholarly show, we try to develop models that would remove as much subjectivity, as much bias as possible, so that these things can kind of emerge outside of everyone's biases. So with respect to this whole GOAT conversation, I think there has to be 3 criteria that a rapper must meet to be in that GOAT conversation. And you have to meet every single one of them, and that's nearly impossible to meet all 3, as well it should be, hence this whole GOAT, status, the greatest of all time. It should be a hollowed, rarefied space that most humans, rappers being among them, will never, be able to approach. So
yeah, most people are most people's top 5 or top 10 are going to hit 2 of these 3 or 1 of these 3, or where are most?
That's exactly right. It really narrows it down, and it eliminates people that you would, if you're just sort of being precious about certain individuals, you would consider them being a part of that conversation. But if you develop a kind of model, like a Venn diagram, where each one of those criteria would have to be met, it removes you from the conversation. It removes your biases, and you have to let that criteria just give its ruling, outside of what you think about it. Right? So the way I see it, there are 3 criteria, as I said. The first being street popularity, right? Or street cred, which is different from like general popularity. For instance, I'll give you a quick example, just to give it context. Someone like MC Hammer, right? Someone like MC Hammer was at one point considered the most popular rapper on the planet, right? But on the streets, you wouldn't have that same sort of status attached to MC Hammer, right? He may have been, he was being listened to probably in Oakland, but the sort of sacred cows of hip hop, the kind of intelligentsia of hip hop, they didn't consider him, having that street popularity, that street credibility. So that immediately eliminates him from the GOAT discussion, as popular as he was, right? So you have that all-important criteria of street popularity or street credibility. And then you have literary merit. You have your use of metaphor, simile, irony, conceit, theme, all those things, and delivered in a way that's original, and that's sort of your signature.
So that would be more of an artist, kind of like a Black Thought, has like just tons of literary merit in comparison.
That's exactly right. So you have that literary merit where, there's a lot to unpack. You can sort of, take a lot of time to kind of decipher it, and it sort of lends itself to critical study in a lot of ways, right? So you have that, and then you have preeminence. Like, did you occupy a moment when you were the premier rapper, the most box office rapper in the world?
Just so record sales as well, like touring and record sales, commercial success, or this is in terms of?
That's exactly right. So record sales, like, sitting at the top of Billboard, your general popularity in the public sphere, all of those things, just being generally considered the most popular in terms of box office rapper in the world. Like, you have to occupy that status,
right.
Which you can say of, a good group of rappers. You can say that, as I said, about MC Hammer. You can say that about Drake. You can say that about Ludacris at one point.
Nelly,
even Nicki Minaj with having 5 #1 singles. Nelly. You have these people that they, for a time, they occupied a space on that hip hop timeline, but they may not meet the other criteria, right? So because they don't meet that, they are eliminated by virtue of not meeting all three criteria. There's kind of a triumvirate. There's a kind of gauntlet of 3 that every rapper has to pass through. And if somehow you manage to hit all 3 of those criteria, if you sort of occupy a space at the nexus, at the mesh point of all 3 of those criteria, then you would have to be considered within that discussion of the greatest of all time, the GOAT.
Of the GOAT status. So 3 key things that I'm pulling from that is you, one, have to have either the street cred, which is popularity among just hip hop heads, street cred wise. This isn't album sales. This isn't any of that industry stuff. 2, commercial, just preeminence. You commercially are the dude. People are paying to albums, merchandise, showing up to tours. People know that you're on the radio, this, that. And 3, lyrical, you're talking with merit, you're talking intellectual and lyrical content and merit, literary merit that comes from just lyricism and skills as an artist. So those,
that's exactly right.
If an artist hits all 3 of those, then that puts them in the ability to be in the GOAT discussion.
You can be in that GOAT discussion. And, whether you like him or not, Eminem sits at the nexus or at the mesh point of that Venn diagram, which means, he would have to be in that GOAT discussion. Just to give you, some context of how strong a figure Eminem is historically, you look at somebody like Rakim, for instance, widely considered one of the best rappers ever to live.
Right.
He was popular, in his own right. He certainly had the literary merit, but he never occupied that moment in which he was the most box office rapper.
Right.
So at his height, he was a part of a group, Eric Beat and Rakim, and that group was never as preeminent at the time as, say, Run DMC or even Boogie Down Productions, or even individuals like Dougie Fresh or Big Daddy Kane. He's greater than them, right? He is much more in that GOAT discussion than they are because of the other criteria. But when you compare him to someone like Eminem, he doesn't quite meet all the criteria that Eminem meets because of the one factor, right? Preeminence. Right. So Rakim never occupied a moment in the hip hop timeline in which he was the most box office rapper in the world. He doesn't meet every single criteria, which is almost not fair because he is certainly an essential figure in the history of hip hop. But that GOAT status, it has an unfair criteria so high that it eliminates some who are considered by many to be in that conversation.
I feel that, but one of the things you're saying though, like the unfair part of it, is that for most hip hop heads, when you speak about the GOAT, they're mostly, I think, highly focused on skill set, and they're breaking the skill set, literary content, skill set thing down into different things. Because one of the, I think the biggest knocks on Eminem, especially among just hip hop heads, the fact that he's a white rapper. You can't deny that he has skills, but just the street cred part of it, he doesn't get the street cred part of it, because there's many who argue that there's just as many rappers with speed and cadence and dope styles as Eminem. The fact that he's white and came out with Dr. Dre helped catapult him to such a crossover commercial version of hip hop that it's much easier for the whole world to consume him in a way that other rappers might not be. Like Rakim couldn't get consumed like that based on the fact that, you know, his time period and who he was. He can't be that polarizing figure in terms of how Eminem was or is.
Well, you're right about that. He makes some interesting points, and I think that's kind of where Snoop was going in his comments on Eminem. You know, but during that time that, you know, Rakim was sort of at his prime, you had other black rappers who were box office. You know, they were extreme. Like we said, Run DMC were sort of making, you know, they were sort of producing numbers that were, you know, comparable to the biggest rock stars at the time.
Right.
You know, so that status could be occupied by a black rapper. In fact, rap was brought to the mainstream by black rappers. You know,
right.
Hip hop became a global phenomenon because of black rappers. But this whole conversation with Eminem is interesting because, you know, you're absolutely right that, you know, Eminem, he does, you know, he is able to take advantage of privilege in that respect. But yeah, because, you know, he sort of occupies this unique space as a white rapper, you did have this internal debate going on amongst the hip hop intelligentsia, amongst the sacred cows of hip hop. But regardless of what the outcome was of that discussion, Eminem was still being listened to on the streets. Yeah. He's still street cred criteria because the streets were listening to him.
Well, man, for me, I'm sure for him too, but I speak for myself. I'm such a huge Eminem fan, and especially from his first 3 albums, I was like all the way in. You know what I mean? I'm still all the way in because he's still amazing. But, you know, that was a point in my life, a very pivotal point in my rap career, my rap. My first song I ever made was literally just biting Eminem and Nas.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If you go listen, you would hear both influences. And I feel like when you start rapping in the beginning, you really just take all your influences and you just rap like them until eventually you become who you are from all these influences. And he
melting pot, right?
Yeah, Eminem was a main ingredient.
The MCs of today, the MCs of the early 2000s, of the 2010s, they all consistently credit Eminem as being an influence. I mean, that's regardless of what that discussion was with respect to Eminem and whether he should be considered one of these MCs that meet that street credibility criteria. The fact is, he did meet that criteria. The streets were listening.
He's a very polarizing, like ignited figure because like you said, he does have hands down the skill set that everyone will speak to, and that he has the skills as a rapper. There's no doubt about it. But like you were talking about before, based on the fact being white, he has a sort of white privilege in his ability to be controversial on a pop level and also be commercially successful repetitively, where there's a ton of these other artists who you would say, even someone like Rakim or even Big Daddy Kane, you don't see that many, same thing with Public Enemy. You don't see these many KRS-One, dark-skinned brothers who are controversial, able to be as commercially successful. That's why some people might even argue that like Hammer couldn't have that intellectual depth and context because he was the dancing dark-skinned brother. He wasn't making political statements, being controversial, stirring up the mug, making you think critically. You know, that's a very hard figure for the record company. It's hard to sell the dark-skinned black man who wants to incite free thought and potentially what is almost that riot energy. When Eminem does it, he's selling back to his own people. Because when you think about hip hop from that bigger context, it's mostly has that kind of colonial relationship where you have record companies going into the ghetto or the hood, taking this unrefined project and then selling it to the colonies, like the suburbs. Eminem he kind of walks that line. He's kind of the kid that's not really from the middle class, poor, but still has enough white privilege to be successful as he gets money. So he's in this very weird, and because he has the skill set, no one can really argue his skills, but you also, his magnifying glass and his the microscope that he's under is different from a lot of these black artists, I feel, and that's probably the biggest knock to his street credit.
Right, and that's therein lies the sort of subject matter of this kind of discussion over Eminem that's had amongst, as I call, the hip hop intelligentsia, the sort of sacred cows of hip hop. But as I always go back to, despite that debate that's taken place historically, and in the internal circles, in the sort of inner circle of hip hop, the streets were still listening to Eminem. That cannot be denied. And with respect to dark-skinned rappers, because there is a colorism component in hip hop, as there is a colorism component in all of American society. That conversation does lend itself to a legitimate sort of concern. But if you look at the most popular rappers throughout the history of the genre, you do have black and dark-skinned rappers who were considered at their time, or at one time or another, the most popular rappers in the world. Lil Wayne,
Black Thought is a very, in terms of just skill set, in terms of intellectual quality and actually just rap skills, like we talked about literary quality, Black Thought is right there on the upper echelon, right? So him and Eminem are very similar in terms of that, but even with someone like Black Thought, who's been doing it for so long and also includes the live element, he to this day gets all types of shit for selling out to be on the television show with the band doing the night.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But that's
dark-skinned brother, and he has so much just straight up just skills. He never has been commercially received by the bigger white American audience.
Yeah, it's hard to. Eminem is certainly a beneficiary of a kind of white privilege. It's been pervasive in American culture from the very beginning. But It's hard to quantify how much of his success can be attributed to white privilege, because as you mentioned, he does have an incredible skill set. He has originality in how he parses words lyrically, how he delivers them. As can be said about Black Thought, but he does have a certain degree of charisma that Black Thought has always lacked, and that's probably what Black Thought was up against, as well as some of these other instances of privilege, because as we have to sort of be honest about, and this is why the criteria has to kind of levy its ruling outside of all of these sort of things that we kind of latch on to. You do have someone like Lil Wayne who does meet all three of those criteria. So let's look at rappers who are in that discussion. You have Tupac. He meets all three of those criteria. Tupac was definitely popular on the streets. He definitely had a kind of literary merit to his rhyme scheme, right? To his body of work. Yep. And he was preeminent. He was considered the most box office rapper at a point in that hip hop timeline. You also have Biggie. You also have, say again?
Yeah, Biggie as well is also in a very similar boat.
Exactly. You also have Biggie, you have Jay-Z, you have Kanye, you have Wayne. And guess who else you have in that discussion?
Who's that?
You might even say that Snoop is in that discussion as well, because he does have box office sort of Billboard track record to prove his preeminence. At a certain time in the 90s, he was the most box office rapper. He does display a kind of signature style that is immediately identifiable as Snoop's style, which is a kind of a literary signature, and he was certainly popular on the streets. So he meets all three of those criteria. But you have to sort of, if you let that Venn diagram speak for itself, you have to say that so does Eminem.